In 2018, 2,039 high school students died by suicide, making it the second leading cause of death among youth ages 14 to 18. Mental illness and suicidal ideation are prevalent among this age group. Thus, it is imperative that we work towards suicide prevention for our youth. Welcome to Normalize The Conversation. I'm your host, Francesca Reicheter, and today I'm joined by student-athlete at Bates College and co-founder of Kick It for a Cause, Inc., Sam Gerry. From a charity fundraiser started in high school, supporting organizations like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and Mental Health America, evolving into a nonprofit organization, Sam is passionate about advocacy work in suicide prevention as a result of his own suicidality. Join us as Sam shares his mental health journey and how he balances school and mental health. Sam, thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Before we get into this conversation, I really want to check in. How are you really?
I'm admittedly really bad at checking in with myself and figuring out how I'm really doing. I feel like, relatively speaking, right now I'm doing okay. School's a lot, juggling a full course load with everything. But yeah, I feel like I'm doing okay. I appreciate you asking.
Of course, it is so hard to remember to make time to check in with ourselves and then to actually be honest with ourselves. I don't know about you, but I struggle to be honest with myself. I'm like, oh no, I can handle this. I can handle more and more and more. And then I'm on the floor crying because there's way too many deadlines in 1 week. And I'm like, I can't even catch my breath.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where, especially kind of like you're alluding to at school, where, things can be smooth sailing for a couple of weeks, and then you just have that 1 week, whether it's midterms or finals, or sometimes even for me, it's just like random weeks here and there where like everything kind of collapses at once and everything's due. Oh, it's so difficult, but I really couldn't agree more.
I just went through midterm week. I just wrapped up yesterday. Oh, I hate it. It's way too much stress for no good reason because ultimately your whole life is not dependent on that one midterm grade, but for me it is in that moment.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm totally in the same boat. I'm very much one of those people who seeks academic validation and trying to fulfill my own expectations. I feel like at least since high school, it hasn't been so bad as far as external pressure, but the internal pressure is just so intense, and trying to, keep a really high GPA while doing everything else is just so difficult. Like, just so underrated how difficult it is.
It is. And for me, it's about proving that I can handle all of it because everyone's like, I don't know how you handle it, or you're gonna mess up your grades, so there's no way you can do this. And I'm like, I have to keep that perfect GPA so that I can prove I can handle it. But realistically, it's no, it doesn't matter. However, in my head, it really genuinely matters because I just want them to be wrong. I don't want someone to be right that I can't handle it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I'm at all the time.
Yeah, totally. And I also feel like I have this reputation to uphold. I feel like if there's any kind of chink in the armor, like, I am a failure. And that's so tough to cope with. I'm really lucky in that I've had the privilege to have really great success. I'm 21 years old and I've done pretty cool things. But it really does feel like, if one little thing goes awry, whether it be my grades or kind of letting my advocacy work or research slip, I feel like that it feels like the house of cards is gonna all come falling down, which is fortunately not true, but it's really tough to shake that thought.
It is, especially at such a young age to have all that pressure on your shoulders. I mean, you said you started Kick It for a Cause in high school. Tell us more about Kick It for a Cause and kind of what inspired you to start it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really started, as I mentioned before, back in our senior year of high school. So at this point, actually, I think the idea for it, or the inception of Kick It, started just after our junior year. A buddy of mine, his name is Noah Dollywall. We both went to high school at Woburn Memorial High School, like I said, in Woburn, where I'm from. And he approached me and he really kind of said, I I really want to get more involved with the community. I know that you're heavily involved with suicide prevention. So at that point, I had been pretty deep in advocacy for about a year and a half. And he was like, why not start some sort of intramural tournament? And that was something that really resonated with the both of us because we were both athletes in high school. Noah played football and he ran track, and I played golf. So it just kind of worked. So really from there, we met at our local library. And I'll never forget it. We were kind of in a stalemate as far as what intramural sport we should choose. So we left it up to an Instagram poll. I think it was either it was obviously kickball and I think maybe dodgeball or something like that. I totally forget. And I guess kind of the rest is history. Kickball won. We had our first tournament that October in 2019. It was a really huge success compared to what we were expecting, which was awesome. And we were kind of like, okay, we might be able to do something with this. From there in 2020, obviously, unfortunately, our tournament got canceled due to COVID. So we started a scholarship that supports 2 students with $1,500 to further their education. And then we've also obviously kickstarted the kickball tournaments again in 2020, 2022. Where we've been having those in June and May, respectively. And we're also really excited to be starting a couple of new initiatives, one of which is called the Grant Pitch Contest, which is in collaboration with another nonprofit in the area. It's called Social Capital Incorporated, where students, or teams of students rather, of middle schoolers and high schoolers will be able to come together with kind of like a coach or an advisor, develop some sort of initiative or mental health program that they'd like to see implemented within their schools. They'll pitch those ideas to a group of judges, which will include stakeholders throughout the community, and the winners will be given a few $1,000s to go implement that. So it's little things like that that are really, really special. Obviously, a lot of our fundraising, we also like to support local kind of branches or chapters of bigger organizations, such as the Massachusetts chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, NAMI, Massachusetts, each of which we just made $1,000 donations to. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. Obviously, it's a lot upholding or keeping a nonprofit afloat. We first incorporated as a nonprofit in September of 2020, and from there, it's just been a blast, and I love every second of it.
You've grown very quickly too, to start from kind of a kickball tournament to adding these scholarship piece to now this competition with, did you say elementary and middle, or just middle and high?
It's middle and high. Mm-hmm.
Middle and high school. That is incredible. I mean, you've incorporated in 2020 and to get this far. I mean, why did you choose mental health? What kind of motivates you through this every day?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it goes back to this idea of personal experience, or it goes back to the point of personal experience. Sometimes in research they say research is me search. Having experienced this myself, really, really intense suicidality to the point of being sent into an outpatient hospitalization program, and also, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder. It's something that's really near and dear to my heart, and something that really motivates me each and every day, to know what I've been through, to know what other people go through. That's what really inspires me. I'm not necessarily inspired or motivated by the accolades, or people saying like, oh, that's so cool, you started a nonprofit in high school. It's like it's cool, but it's what really motivates me are the people who are impacted, and the people who have shared their stories and their experiences with us, and have really been able to use Kick It as kind of a stepping stone to either start or continue their own recovery journey. So that's been really, really special, and something that motivates both myself, Noah, and our entire team.
That is incredible. I mean, to come from a place of struggle and pain, and to really be able to turn it into not just purpose, but action. A lot of people talk about wanting to do things, but not as many people go out and actually do it and continue it. I mean, especially so young. There's not a lot of people in our age range that are willing to make that commitment, or willing to speak up about something that's so vulnerable. What do you think kind of makes you different, that makes you this leader?
Yeah, that's a great question, and sometimes I don't even have a good answer for this. I think a lot of it's just luck. A lot of my experiences, especially within advocacy, have kind of been presented to me on a platter. My first fundraising opportunity to really kickstart my advocacy journey, for lack of a better term, was presented to me through golf, through the American Junior Golf Association, which was kind of like a golf league, for lack of a better term, for those familiar with other sports, and maybe it's like AAU basketball or something of the sort. And a lot of media, at least initial media, was really lucky to do two interviews, one in Golf Digest, which is more probably the biggest golf magazine in the world, and then also on the Golf Channel, which is an NBC channel, were really through connections. And I think so kind of to really sum everything up, I think for me, really getting started, it was a lot of luck, it was a lot of fortune, and from there, gaining that experience really kind of formed me into this. I wouldn't say leader, but I became more familiar with those experiences, and being able to leverage that has definitely gotten to this point. So it certainly isn't all some inherent skill or inherent talent. I'm definitely very privileged and very lucky in that sense.
I'd still say the word leader. I mean, to have, again, come from a place where you were hurting, even to have these opportunities handed to you and to want to do them. As, like, again, within our age range, there's not a lot of people who are willing to put so many other people ahead of themselves. There's a lot of pressure, I think, on our generation to accomplish a lot and to have these kind of luxurious lives as people have on social media and to keep up. So to actually come from a place of authenticity and vulnerability and want to be that support for others is something that I admire more than I'd admire any other trait. So I hope you celebrate that about yourself because it's incredible. But I really want to talk about how you manage all of it. I mean, we talked about how stressful it can be with school. But I mean, you do school, you do research, you're on the golf team, you do this nonprofit. I mean, are you tired?
Oh, very, very tired. Admittedly, it's a much rockier road than people may see or people may appreciate. It's kind of one of those cliches where I maybe make it look much easier than it actually is. And I think that's maybe because of social media. It's very easy to kind of portray yourself in a very positive light with few flaws. I think that's pretty difficult to dispute. And things slip up quite a bit, whether it be falling a bit behind on my research work or being pinched by an assignment here or there, or falling a bit behind with the nonprofit. And that definitely happens sometimes, especially it's really, really difficult in our off season. And our off season is really for us like June to maybe September, October, and then that's when we start planning our main event again. It can be really, really difficult to find the motivation even to meet on a weekly basis with Noah, Emily, who's our executive director, and then our entire team. So admittedly, there are quite a few sacrifices that I have to make. And it's kind of on a whim as well. Some days I'll wake up and I'm like, all right, I have to get this assignment done. I'm not focusing on research or kick it today. That's just not feasible. It's not possible. With that said, though, I think over time, I've definitely gotten better at being efficient with my time, making sure that things are getting done in an efficient manner and things are getting done well. I think that's important too. So I don't run into any issues later is really, really important. So it's a bit of a mix. It's definitely, like I said, not as easy as it looks. Can be really, really tricky and can feel like you're gasping for air at times, but it's definitely not impossible, especially with a team. And I think that's the most important thing. Just having people around you, having those supports. Without them, none of this would be possible.
I totally resonate with that. It's I don't handle it with as much grace as it may seem on social media. And I try explaining that to people, like, how do you do it? And I'm like, it's a lot of crying on the floor. Like, it's genuinely a lot of breakdowns. It's not as easy as it looks. And again, that feeling of added pressure of kind of living up to expectation because I've been managing it for so long. I've been able to do this. am expected to be able to do it. So now what happens if one of my grades slip, or if I don't have this podcast episode, I don't have a new one every single week, or if the next book is late, or like what happens if one piece is off? And for me, it's kind of like that crumbling pressure of trying to live up to maybe the standards I set for myself. I don't know if other people care as much as I care and the deadlines I've imposed, but for me, it can feel very like consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really frustrating, and I think really going back to your point, I really like that point that you made, especially like I've done this for so long. Why can't I do it now?
Yeah.
And just trying to cope with that disappointment if something does go wrong. I remember like quite literally 2 weeks ago, I got like I think my need for academic validation is bad enough to the point where if I'm getting like B's on assignments, I'm like devastated. And you know, it's happened like a couple times this semester, and I sound like a um I sound like a jerk when I say that. But it's something that's really, really difficult to manage, and something that I've definitely had to work on improving over the past couple of years since I've been here.
That academic validation, I mean, last night, I totally resonate that last night. I know I got one question wrong at minimum on my midterm. This is the first time I'm not going to get 100 on something in this program, which sounds like annoying to say,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I can't wait to like confront my teacher and annoy him about it because it's bothering me to where I couldn't sleep just waking up thinking about that one question. How like it wasn't something that I should have gotten wrong. So over and over again in my head, I'm like, why didn't I remember that word? Like it's one word. Why didn't I remember it? It's like I've studied it. It's on my study guide. I have like 3 separate study guides and it's on all of them. How did I not get it right? And for me, the academic validation, knowing that I got something wrong, that something tripped me up, genuinely, I don't know why I'm like this. I'm such a perfectionist. Now my giant fear for the rest of the semester is going to be losing any more points. So then trying to balance anything else on my plate with school has now become an added pressure of I was able to maintain it for so long. What did I do wrong?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And kind of like we're both like I hate to be that person.
Right.
You know, some people seek academic validation, some people seek social validation, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's kind of like the snowball effect where, like you said, if you get one thing wrong or you slip up here, you're like, oh my gosh, if I do this again, like I'm screwed. Like there's no recovering. Which, like I said, fortunately is not true. That's really just something I'm subconsciously or consciously making up in my own mind. But that doesn't mean it's not something that should be addressed, because at the end of the day, it is something that's bothering me, and it is something that's taking away from other ways I could be better spending my time.
Exactly. And it's validating that even when it might seem silly to others or even silly to ourselves, like we're talking about it and we're like, it sounds silly, but it's still very real. And to validate, even if it instead of minimize, I mean, I minimize it all the time. The other day I was complaining, I was like, it's really hard because when you're on the top and you're perfect, the only way to go is down. So it's waiting for that moment. And I'm like, eventually it has to happen, right? Like it's not a big deal. And I'm trying to minimize it, but it's to me, it's a huge deal. And I have to learn to validate that fear and then cope with it and kind of prepare myself, but not get in my head and force it to happen.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And one thing I'd like to say is it's just really not necessarily dangerous, but I think I've tried so long to like repress and suppress those thoughts and feelings, and probably the best thing I've ever done is just recognizing them.
Yeah.
Recognizing that they're there, and while it's not always a fixable problem, sometimes it is. Sometimes in certain scenarios, there are things that I can do to either distract myself or find a way to mitigate those feelings. But a lot of times it's just not, and accepting that and being okay with it is just like so incredibly helpful.
Yes. So, how do you kind of maintain your mental health and cope with that kind of overwhelming stress?
Yeah, I think in a really, really bad admission, especially as someone who's like so deep in the mental health advocacy sauce, is that I'm really, really bad at taking care of my mental health. And it's something that I'm always trying to get better at, but something that I'm still really, really bad at doing, as far as setting aside time to take care of myself and engage in self-care activities, whatever that might look like. I've gone for a really, really long time. I'd say really since I've been in advocacy, or at least been in advocacy like very, very seriously, where it just has not been a part of my schedule, at least during the academic year. So really for me, the biggest thing is making sure I'm at least making an effort to carve out that time and being very intentional during that time, making sure I'm doing everything I possibly can to keep that time sacred. And while I'm going through that time, for lack of a better term, or while I'm in that moment, making sure that I'm not thinking about things that do cause me stress or do cause me worry. So admittedly, it's really, really difficult. I think as many people would agree, and I'm not great with it. But making sure I'm really, really intentional and being really firm with myself about the boundaries I want to set for myself and the boundaries I'm going to set moving forward.
Thank you for being so honest because same, same. It's so hard to carve out that time, especially for me. It's like that opportunity cost, right? It's like I could make time to do this thing for myself, but then I feel guilty because I could be spending that time studying and bettering my grades or working on this paper, or I could be getting these podcast episodes out, or I could be responding to people. I could be making encouragement cards. I could be expanding things. There's so many different things I could be doing. And do I deserve that time? And am I willing to choose myself over helping and possibly saving someone else?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think one thing that I've learned, at least and this is completely my opinion, but selflessness, at least in like this space, is so incredibly overrated. I think people are a bit afraid of being selfish, and very understandably so. But if you are going to take care of yourself adequately, or at least in the ways that you should be, you have to be a bit selfish. You have to be a bit willing to whether it be like turn down other opportunities to make sure that you're engaging in self-care the way that you previously planned, or whatever it might be, or like I said, just being so rigid and so strict with that time, just making sure that you are taking care of yourself. You definitely have to be a bit selfish, and that's something that's like totally okay. Like I said before, selfish doesn't sound right. It sounds selfish, and it's not a very good look, but at the end of the day, it's absolutely necessary.
It absolutely is. And I like how you said earlier, carving out that time. For me, that's something I've recently been really working on, and I tend to do it during sleeping hours. So, like sunrise, I love to just get up and go watch the sunrise. Probably already not sleeping at that point, anyways, when I'm getting up to go watch the sunrise. But making that space for me, I don't know what it is about sunrise, but watching the sun come up is something like it's a new day, just some sense of hope. I have no idea what it is that really makes me so happy. But for me, making that space to just do something I genuinely enjoy and do it on my own, where I don't feel obligated to have to be this happy, bubbly person that people see all the time, making the space to just, if I want to cry or be silent or just think or not think or listen to music or breathe, just I can be whatever I'm feeling in that moment without worrying about putting on this face. I have to show up for other people.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's another really important point, is that during that time, it takes a lot of flexibility. I think when some people think of, self-care activities, whether it be something really, really simple or something not as simple, I feel like sometimes people feel like they have to be really, really happy when they're engaging in self-care activities sometimes, or at least like joyous to some extent, when in reality, I think one of the most important things is making sure that you're allowing yourself to feel, and allowing yourself to really think about or feel whatever comes to you. Kind of going back to what we were discussing before, just making sure that whatever you are feeling, you accept that. You don't try to suppress them. You don't try to repress them. You don't try to, put a smile on your face when that's not really, or that's not a reflection of how you're really feeling. So yeah, and admittedly that's really, really difficult to do. And inherently you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position, but at the same time, it's something that's also really important.
You touched on two really important misconceptions with self-care. I mean, one, the whole selfish versus selfless piece, right, that you talked about earlier. It's so hard to, I mean, the word selfish sounds, like you said, so selfish. It sounds bad, but really choosing yourself isn't a bad thing. There's a difference between like choosing yourself in a malicious way to hurt somebody else and choosing yourself in a way to support, uplift, give yourself some kind of love and compassion that you need so that you can be your best self and be there for someone else. And I think that the definition and the line of selfish and self-care have really been enmeshed in a bad way. But then going into what you said about self-care, it doesn't have to be like this happy thing all the time. Self-care is about showing yourself love and compassion. And that was a misconception I lived with for so long. I thought like it had to be something that made me super happy. Like it had to be going shopping or doing a face mask or just something kind of external. But really, at least for me, self-care is about offering that space to feel, to process, to just be, to find a piece of serenity and calm within myself. It's not about being this bubbly, energetic, extroverted person that I have to put on all the time. It's about just being me in that moment and loving myself for it instead of hating myself for not feeling super grateful in that moment or super excited and in love with everything.
Yeah. Admittedly, I really couldn't put it any better myself. And I think that's definitely one of those hurdles, like you said, that takes a really long time to jump and to get over. But once, like in just speaking from my personal experience, when I was able to overcome that, it was such a game changer. And really changed the way that I view self-care, and it also made me want to prioritize it more, knowing that this was my moment to be vulnerable, and this was my moment to truly just feel what I was feeling, and that to me was really important and really valuable.
It is so valuable to get to a place where you're like, I can just be vulnerable, and being vulnerable with yourself. For me, at least, it was easier to be vulnerable. Like, I don't want to say with other people, but with like my parents, with my closest friend, like maybe crying or opening up to them felt a lot easier than just doing it alone and being honest and open to myself with myself when no one else was around to comfort and having to validate myself. For you, what was that process of kind of vulnerability and exploring it like?
Yeah. So for me, this is really, really interesting because, especially in the context of my advocacy, I kind of went from 0 to 100. And what I specifically mean by that is, when I was initially struggling with depression, anxiety, suicidality, I was talking to my parents about it, and they were so incredibly supportive. But no one else. I didn't tell my friends about it. I didn't tell really anyone else besides my parents, and maybe I mentioned it to my siblings once or twice. And then once that opportunity to fundraise came along, it was like I was like a fire hose. I just let everything out. Admittedly, looking back on it, I was maybe a bit too brash. I went into quite a bit quite a bit of detail, not like too much or anything that was like really bad. But looking back on it, I was like, whoa! For the first time, like I was ever really talking about this stuff, I got really vulnerable really quickly. And for me, that was huge. I feel like after that, I was just so incredibly comfortable talking about really like my deepest like suicidal experiences, which is so weird to say, but it was true. But to your point, like I still was uncomfortable being vulnerable on my own and admitting to myself, not necessarily admitting to myself, that's maybe a bad way of phrasing it, but really being open with myself when on my own. And admittedly, in some cases, it probably was a bit performative. One thing that someone said to me a while ago is like almost like an addiction to vulnerability. Like sometimes, all of the praise and all of the support that is really overflowing. I was incredibly fortunate to have a lot of support when I did share my story. Um, it just feels so good. It just feels so good to like for someone to reach out to you, maybe that you haven't talked to in a while, or family, friends, or other supporters just sharing their own experiences and really being able to make that connection is really special. But after a while, admittedly, I kind of got myself into a bit of trouble with that. I made one post it was actually early 2020, and I kind of did the same thing, except not in as much detail because I shared my suicidal experiences as it was happening. Um, and that was a really, really tricky space to navigate, not because I was uncomfortable sharing my experiences, but because everyone went into crisis mode and thought I was actually going to act on my thoughts. That's a very complex situation to be in, especially for those who don't quite understand, in my opinion, active versus passive suicidality, what's a crisis, what's not. I think one thing that we do a really bad job of is treating suicidal individuals like they're human. And by recognizing that not every suicidal individual is in a crisis, or as much of a crisis as we deem them to be. But from there, basically, while I received plenty of support, there were probably equally as many people who were not equally as many people, but there were people who went to administrators at school, understandably so, or went to teachers at school, or went to someone else to where I was pulled out of my classes and was not necessarily forced, but I didn't really have much of a choice and was sent to an outpatient hospitalization program, which was just not a good time for anyone who has been in inpatient or outpatient. For those who are unfamiliar, outpatient is similar to inpatient in that like a similar setting, except you just go home every night as opposed to overnight stays. So I was there for 2 weeks and I was like, wow, I kind of never want to talk about this again. And it made advocacy really, really difficult because I think a very important component of my own advocacy was my own vulnerability. And I felt like that was kind of stripped from me. And it was just, I almost felt like I was standing on a stage like naked. Like it was just like, oh, I let everything out and it really came back to bite me and it really hurt me. And that's something I still struggle with today. So yeah, as far as my comfort level with my own vulnerability goes, I am just like all over the map. Like right now, I think I'm very, very comfortable speaking about it in certain contexts with friends and doing things like this. But as far as the way I used to share it on social media and very, very publicly, like I would seriously question whether I'd ever do that again. And I mean, this is not necessarily super important to my vulnerability, but some people have noticed that like I'm not posting as much. That is very much the reason why. So yeah, it's a very intricate process.
It's, I mean, it's really traumatic, I feel like, when you are so open and so vulnerable, and it kind of backfires in a way where you get sent to an outpatient. I mean, I was inpatient. I can tell you I felt a little traumatized by it. It wasn't my favorite experience. It wasn't something that I'd ever really want to go through again. And that fear of opening up and how much can I open up to avoid that, for me, I try to post very vulnerably, especially recently, and I definitely question how far I can go because I get in trouble sometimes and people are like, "Are you sure you're safe?" And I'm like, "No, I have a dark and twisty mind, but I'm good. Like, I'm good. I'm not going to hurt myself or act on these thoughts. Been there, done that." I'm at this place where I just want to be honest that it's not always rainbows and butterflies. It's something that I genuinely deal with pretty much on a daily basis. And that's normal for me. And if someone else is going through that and having these passive thoughts, that's okay and you're not alone. But it can really backfire when people don't understand that you can have these passive thoughts and not actually be in imminent risk of ending your life.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with everything you said there. and kind of going back to that point of it really just frustrates me how poorly we respond to like just suicide or suicidal thoughts or really more suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviors. Of course, we need to act on those. We need to make sure that person is safe and does not have access to means or methods. But at the same time, I think we do need to really give those individuals autonomy. And obviously, I think it's still really, really important to sit down with someone and have those conversations and discuss whether or not they perceive themselves to be safe. And obviously that's, as you mentioned, it's really, really tricky. When does passive suicidality turn into passive suicidality? I am not a professional. I am not saying that we should go one way or another. We should respond in one way or another. I just really wish that passively or suicidal individuals as a whole were not seen as some sort of ticking time bomb, which makes it really, really frustrating. And it's definitely one of my biggest peeves with suicide prevention as a whole.
I could not agree more. There needs to be more discussion on how to respond to somebody and how to check in on their safety instead of this assumption and this response out of this fear of crisis. I mean, it's so normal. It is so normal if someone's telling you they're having thoughts of suicide to like go into crisis mode. I completely understand that. Telling my parents that I'm having thoughts of suicide is not going to go well because they're terrified. They're my parents. They don't want something to happen to me. And it's a very real fear as it's something that has really happened before and they had to visit their child in a psych ward. So I get that. But something my parents have learned is to check in and say, like, are you safe? Do you need to go to a facility? And just that piece of asking, are you safe? And I can say, no, yeah, I'm safe. I'm not going to hurt myself. Or if I was, I can say, no, I really do need you to check me into a facility. Will you drive me? And I know that they will. But if they didn't ask and they just responded and just pick me up and drop me off at a facility, I mean, I'm old enough that they can't really force me to get treatment that I don't want. However, it's a lot more traumatizing when you're perceived dangerous to yourself or dangerous to someone else when you're not. You're just genuinely having these thoughts that we all have to some capacity at some point in life. And there are other things like validation, like support, like just having someone to be honest with how you're feeling in that moment without them judging or responding, but just being present.
Yeah, and that really reminds me of I think the American Association of Suicidality posted this today, but I think they posted a statistic saying like 96% of people would support an individual they knew if they knew they were suicidal. And I think they're missing the big picture and really and not asking the important questions like how would you respond and do you know how to appropriately respond? One really, really cool thing and one reason why I love the research side of things is that we're able to answer and really dispel a lot of stigma when it comes to these different responses. So I think probably one of my favorites and one of the biggest stigmas for a long time, and one that still very much exists, is this idea that asking about suicide has iatrogenic effects. Big word, but essentially it's asking the question of whether asking someone if they're suicidal makes suicidal thoughts worse. And there have been actually a lot of studies that have shown that that is just not the case. If anything, that has a lot of positive effects. A lot of people think that like merely mentioning suicide will make it worse, when that isn't true. And this has been shown in both adult and youth and adolescent populations, which is really, really encouraging and really shines a light on obviously how people should be responding, but how these stigmas impact the ways in which we go about responding. So I think we definitely have a big hurdle to jump there as far as really instructing, whether it be parents or guardians or teachers or coaches or other supports, how to respond. I think that's something that admittedly is going to take a while and it's going to take a lot of work. And unfortunately, because of the interdisciplinary nature of suicide prevention, it gets really political really quickly. So that's a huge, huge barrier currently in the space. but I think we will be able to get there at some point where people feel not necessarily comfortable. I think it's impossible to feel comfortable, and not necessarily impossible, but difficult to feel comfortable when supporting a suicidal individual. But making them more confident in their ability to get them the immediate support that they need.
I hope we get to that space because I think suicide prevention, in my opinion, for so long has been kind of at that end point, like preventing when someone already has the gun in their hand, right? When someone already has the pills in their hand, that's kind of when prevention has started. But what if we taught people how to have these conversations, how to check in, how to respond and validate instead of invalidate or gaslight out of fear? A lot of times, I really truly believe that a lot of invalidation and gaslighting comes from not knowing how to respond and thinking by kind of minimizing, be like, oh, you don't really have those thoughts, you're being dramatic, kind of makes you almost feel better because you don't have to respond to it. You can just kind of push it to the side. And not because people necessarily want to be selfish or be mean and not talk about it, they just don't know how. So having that handbook, having that guide, having something that actually teaches you how to respond, what you can say, what's not helpful to say, maybe just some sample dialogue can make all the difference in someone saying, I'm struggling, I just kind of need someone to talk to, being invalidated, never talking about it, keeping it all inside, and then ending up attempting to end their life or ending their life.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of to one of your first points, that I really liked is that suicide prevention, as it currently stands, is for the most part really just intervention.
Yeah.
Downstream prevention occurs so much earlier than the point where individuals even have sometimes suicidal thoughts, or not necessarily suicidal thoughts. That's a poor way of wording it, but so much before they make that attempt, or they engage in these self-injurious behaviors. And that's something that's really kind of bothered me, because where I think a lot of times in the space trying to perfect intervention when we really should be trying to focus on prevention. And like you said, if having some sort of resource or educational curricula out there would be so incredibly valuable for so many people, especially those who are administering that like immediate support. I know right now, I think it's in Europe or maybe the UK or something like that. There was actually a petition going out about some sort of formalized curriculum for teachers, parents, administrators. It got over 140,000 signatures. The problem here in the United States is that because of unfortunate political stances, people are very much against, or some people are very much against mental health education within schools, and that's a huge problem. I think one of our biggest barriers in suicide prevention right now is because it's so political, and it's really unfortunate to see that. But I'm like I said before, I'm optimistic about our future. I think we'll be able to get there at some point, but it's definitely going to be an uphill battle, and for many reasons.
Yes, it has become so political, and it's become one side agreeing and one side kind of pulling away from it, and people should just be resilient. One thing very recent that happened in Florida that really made me mad was someone was like, yeah, the government wants to put more money into mental health education, and they want to change the name from mental health to resiliency. And I was like, okay, no, because there's a difference between like helping people build resiliency skills, which yeah, is so important. However, if someone lives with a disorder, a mood disorder, personality disorder, any kind of disorder, being resilient is not going to solve the problem, right? So you can't be like, oh, well, if you're resilient, you'll be fine. No, that's invalidating so many people and kind of making, I know for me, I would feel so angry if someone was like, well, just be more resilient. I can't control a chemical imbalance in my brain that causes these hypomanic episodes or these depressive episodes. I take medication to help stabilize it, but even sometimes that, with all the self-care and coping skills in the world, like won't prevent it. So telling me if I was resilient, this wouldn't happen is just the most unhelpful thing in the world. So it's become so politicized that people want to change the words and change the way we talk about it so that it fits within the party lines kind of beliefs and values, which is so detrimental.
Yeah, it's just so frustrating. And I really think that hits on this idea of toxic positivity. This idea that positive phrases that you might use, like, oh, just be more resilient, or think happy thoughts, or stuff like that, is really just so incredibly unhelpful. It's incredibly invalidating in that it doesn't recognize, the person may fail to recognize the complexity of mental illness, how whether it be biomarkers of mental illness or suicidality, or social factors, whatever it might be. It's just so frustrating, and it's one of those things where a lot of times, especially with those kinds of statements, they're made in good faith, and the intention is to be positive, and to be helpful, but in reality, it's really just not. And changing up the language like that from mental health to resiliency, that's tough. I firmly disagree with that for every reason that you just laid out there.
Yeah, it's really hard when everyone's kind of on different pages, right? And it's not, I think people could really be on the same page if there wasn't so much division in today's world and people didn't feel obligated to pick a side and kind of go very far with it. I think most people genuinely are kind of in the middle on almost everything. And this polarization has made something like mental health so difficult. I mean, this younger generation's growing up in a world where so many bad things are constantly happening, and then the messaging is be resilient. How is that? This is why suicide prevention is really intervention, because we're ignoring their entire childhood, waiting till they're an adult, struggling, and then, oh, well, now here's what we can do for you, instead of in the beginning focusing on building coping skills or affirmations, self-love statements. Keep it age appropriate 100%, but giving them those actual tools instead of just be resilient.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. Really equipping those students with the necessary tools to really be able to approach those problems as they grow up. And like you said, being age appropriate too. You don't need to be teaching third graders about suicide, and that kind of stuff. And I totally agree with that argument, that it does need to be age appropriate, but at the same time, we're just failing so many young people and so many adults as well by not really emphasizing the importance of that education. And it's so unfortunate that things are so polarized these days. And I think one of our biggest issues is that one thing you mentioned, that the people on the far ends of the spectrum are the loudest, and also I feel like there's this weird sense that you need to unconditionally support one side or the other. Political issues that are beyond the scope of this podcast, but it's a real problem, and because suicide prevention is such a huge public health issue, it's just so incredibly difficult, and admittedly, I really don't think we will be able to make any kind of dent in the space of suicide prevention until we address that issue.
I completely agree. And until we're willing to kind of listen, have conversations, engage in dialogue that's helpful and supportive, I think there's honestly a lot of misconceptions and confusion and the stigma around mental health that makes people afraid to want to talk about it and afraid to create the space. I mean, there's so many even parents who don't want to ask for help for themselves or for their kids because they're like, there's this fear, what if they take my kids away from me? Or what's going to happen? What if they don't think I'm a fit parent? And realistically, that's very, very likely not going to be the case. I don't know when exactly it is the case. I'm sure there is a point. I can't say what it is. However, I think if you ask for help, there's no. And people are afraid because there's not enough dialogue about it. There's not enough conversations. That's why conversations like this are so important to me in this podcast, is because we're breaking down those misconceptions. We're breaking down that stigma and giving people a chance to know that it's okay to engage in this dialogue or even learn from somebody on the podcast if they're afraid to go out and ask someone else. Because if we're not having these conversations, we're not having productive dialogue, these misconceptions, this confusion, this stigma, this prejudice, this discrimination toward people living with mental health conditions is only going to perpetuate, and we're never, like you said, going to be able to move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really couldn't agree with that more. It's shoot, I kind of forgot what you're talking about there.
I was talking about kind of like that fear that parents have, right? That they could take your kids
yes.
away, or just like these misconceptions and how they could perpetuate and make it worse.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry about that. But really it's really, really unfortunate to see how quickly stigma spreads. And it's such a mammoth problem, and something that, will we ever realistically see the end of stigma because it's a social problem? Probably not. But even minimizing it just a little bit seems, at times it can be really discouraging. And specifically in the context of my own advocacy work, seeing the kind of stagnation of like the suicide rates, or not necessarily a stagnation, but the further increasing of suicide rates is just so incredibly discouraging, especially when we look at other countries or other nations, for example. So in 2020, suicide rates, I believe, in the United States went down about 2%. So they kind of flatlined. But preliminary statistics just came out from the CDC a couple of weeks ago saying that they went up by 4% again, which is a huge blow to the gut. Feels like a kick in the teeth. It hurts. And knowing that those stigmas still exist and still thrive. It's one of those things, admittedly, where even sometimes I forget about how bad they are. It's one of those things where sometimes I forget that maybe people don't know as much as me in the space. Not saying that like, oh, I know more than you, I'm better than you, but like some people just don't have the understanding that I do, being so heavily involved in the space. So yeah, it's really, really discouraging, especially when we see that actually Canada saw in 2020 a 16% decrease in suicide rates. And Dr. Tyler Black, he's in Canada, he's a psychiatrist. He ran some statistical analyses, just kind of inferential stats about the future. It looks like they're going to drop from a bit somewhere between 8 and 17% again in 2021. So that to me speaks to kind of going back, and I apologize for making this like so political, but unfortunately it is.
It is.
It's such a, and we're getting to the point where it's becoming, a lot of suicide and suicide prevention is becoming an American problem. I think those stigmas exist around the world. Canada is no exception. Other nations, most certainly, the stigma is worse. But it's becoming and not necessarily, like I said, an American issue, but it's really something that perpetuates in like every part of our lives here, which is really, really discouraging and really frustrating. But I think we can get there someday, or at least do a little bit better.
I agree. There's so much room for growth. There's so much room for us to engage in dialogue, to put more funding, to make more policies that actually support and encourage people instead of make it even more difficult for someone to receive help. I so resonate with that, not always remembering that not everybody is at that place where the stigma is non-existent to them. And I'll be talking to somebody and I'll just like go on be talking about like my mental health journey or something, and they're like their eyes just pop wide open, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is not something that like people talk about normally. And to me, I'm desensitized to my own story because I say it 10 times a day. So like to me, that's like a normal conversation. To another human being who doesn't talk about it, probably not. So it can be really I think, challenging sometimes for these conversations to happen in a productive, supportive way. For me, when I forget that, maybe checking in with somebody and seeing if they're comfortable first before I just kind of start talking about how I ended up on a psych ward. So it's been a lot of learning for myself and a lot of growth. But as we come up on time and wrap up, I want to say thank you for this incredible conversation. And if you could offer one message of hope to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's such a difficult question. I think the biggest or the most important message of hope that I could give. Um, wow, this is a really, really difficult question. Um, Gosh, it's unfortunate how many kind of cliches are out there about giving hope and letting people know that they are truly not alone. I think sometimes telling people that they're not alone is a bit of a cliche in itself, and we, in that sense, sometimes we brush over people's trauma. Sometimes, not all the time, of course. But one thing that's really helped me as far as hope and hopefully can help others is recognizing that your story is your story. Your story is unique. Your story is powerful. Your story is what's a better way of wording that? I think really just knowing that your story is your story. Your story is powerful. Your story has so much worth and so much meaning. And if you are in a challenging situation, or if you are experiencing some of the challenges that either I've experienced or some other mental health or psychological challenge, knowing how many options there are out there for treatment is really, really encouraging. Admittedly, I'm very privileged to have the knowledge of a lot of those resources, kind of like we were just talking about. But it's really all about finding what works best for you. I think we do a really bad job of informing people of the diversity of options when it comes to treatment. A lot of people think it's psychotherapy and medication, and we're limited to that. But there are so many others, whether it be non-clinical, as far as sometimes just talking to a friend, or self-care strategies, or maybe some more non-traditional therapy. I think it's really encouraging to know that we're making great progress in the space, and there are so many options. And if those more traditional options like psychopharmaceuticals or therapy don't work for you, there is hope and there is more out there. So not a great answer there, but hopefully it does the trick.
No, that was a great answer, because there's, again, not enough dialogue toward the fact that there are such a diversity of options available. And what works for someone else may not work for me, may not work for you, and that's okay. I know for me, that was something I struggled with for so long, was this idea that this works for everyone else. Why doesn't it work for me? Something's wrong with me. But we're all unique, we're all different, and we're all going to find something that works for us eventually. So hold on to hope, keep trying, and you're going to get there. Sam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Normalize the Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. This podcast is an initiative of Inspiring My Generation, focusing on normalizing the conversation, bringing education and awareness to the forefront, and amplifying global voices to spark change and hope. Inspiring My Generation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization on a mission towards suicide prevention through awareness, conversation, education, and support. Connect with us on Instagram at Inspiring My Generation, and visit our website inspiringmygeneration.org to learn more about our work and how you can make a difference.